very much. Thank you for coming on a Monday evening. I was talking with my partner in LA. He says, what is so great about Northwestern is that there are people interested in ideas and scholarship in ways that, in LA, for whatever reason, it's the dispersion of the city or the expense of parking at UCLA that is preventing people from doing anything intellectual. We all talk about real estate, it's really demoralizing. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Brian, for that very generous introduction. It is really my great pleasure to be here and participate in this wonderful program. Let me begin, because my talk, when you show images, it takes a little bit longer than it should. Let me begin my talk by pointing out that my presentation is meant to be experienced the way we might look at a series of photographs taken by a camera equipped with different lenses. I'll start with a kind of a wide-angle lens, providing a general history of the way photography was developed in Iran as a case study. And then I'll zoom in on some examples of early photography to elaborate the way amateur and professional Iranian photographers used the new medium to present and document themselves and their cultures. 19th century Iran, I suggest, offers a unique context in which to explore what I call contact vision. That is, a mode of photographic representation born of cross-cultural encounters and circulations. And this is the way it sort of connects to Brian's new work. Iran was one of the first countries in the Middle East in which photography as an art and technology developed, and throughout 19th century was a true contact zone where a broad array of European and non-European cultures encountered and grappled with each other, often in asymmetrical fashion. So broadly speaking, I'm interested in the historical, technological, and political contacts that gave birth to photography in Iran. So I ask, what were the cultural and political implications of the emergence of photography as modern technology, as an art form during the late Qajar dynasty? And what is the relationship between this indigenous archive and what is known to be as the term Orientalism? Let me state parenthetically here that by the term Orientalism, for those of you who may not be familiar, I'm using it throughout my discussion tonight. I mean both the art historical notion, that is a category of subject matter referring to the depiction of the Middle East by European artists in the 19th century. Everything from Jerome to Delacroix, all the sort of famous paintings, European paintings of the Middle East in 19th century, and the term that was coined by Edward Said as well, to imply a particularly ideological mode of representation underpinned by certain exoticist perception of the region. Perhaps surprisingly, I would like to begin my talk about photography during the 19th century with a little known painting. There's actually another version of this in the country Georgia, their museum, which is actually a miniature version of this, slightly different. Now, in this anonymous Qajar work, the court photographer, possibly Reza Khan or Abdullah Qajar, it's not clear, is photographing Nasiruddin Shah, who almost single-handedly introduced the art and technology of photography to Iranians. The image, as an example of the tradition of royal portraiture in Iran, is meant to capture the dynastic power of the Shah, a figure so grand that he is simultaneously painted and photographed by court artists. As a dynastic image, the painting focuses on the grandeur of the Shah's power, symbolically represented by his opulent regalia, royal pose, and the attendant modern technology. He is at once the subject of an old and new form of portraiture. This image, I suggest, marks an aesthetic watershed by foregrounding the shift from painting to photography in mid-19th century Iran. While the court photographer himself occupies a marginal position in relationship to the Shah in the painting, is symbolically kneeling and positioned behind the curtain, the proximity of the photographic apparatus to Nasiruddin Shah suggests that the photographer has displaced the painter in this image. The camera is centrally located between the artist and his subject, presciently symbolizing the privileging of photography as the most powerful means of representation in Iran since the mid-19th century. For those of you who are not familiar with photography, photography was invented in Europe in 1839 in the form of daguerreotype. Now, the presence of the camera here is a reminder that during his reign, Nasruddin Shah's reign, the photographic image became the image of the dynastic power. I will return to the Shah's contribution to the birth of photography as well as the representation of power in Iran shortly. But let me first say something about my rather critical claims in beginning with this painting. I think the painting visually encapsulates my general argument here, that with Nasruddin Shah, who ruled Iran from 1848 to 1896, or almost 50 years, photography became the dominant medium of artistic and political representation in Iran, providing the monarch with the means to sustain his rule over immensely heterogeneous and continuous population at the time when a modern national consciousness and state apparatus began to emerge in Iran. While his grandfather, Fath Ali Shah, enabled the tradition of portrait painting by encouraging and supporting new artists at his court, Nasruddin Shah displaced that artistic tradition with photography as he procured the means and the conditions for the development of this new technology. Contrary to this kind of popular idea that Middle Easterners don't represent people, we do represent people, and that's something that is completely a fallacious claim by some traditional art historians who think calligraphy is the main form of artistic representation. Now, my interest in considering this shift from painting to photography during the reign of Nasruddin Shah is threefold. First, I want to think about the way photography was appropriated at the local level, an issue I will discuss by considering the historical conditions that gave birth to photography. Iranian royalty and elite classes began to photograph themselves, their subjects, and their historical monuments as early as 1850s, in the form of salt prints, for example. And as a result, there's a robust indigenous tradition of photography in the country. Second, I'm interested in the ways photographic self-representation in Iran have been informed by Europeanized aesthetic sensibilities that rendered the photography of this era less organic and oppositional as a genre than one might have expected. And third, I consider the indigenous archive of photography in Iran to better understand the cultural implications of the artistic shift from painting to photography in this era. So what I aim to consider then is the way photography changed representations and exercise of power in Iran by exploring the relationship of this archive to the country's monarchical power. So first, wide-angle lens that I will be working with. The history of photography in Iran has been completely overlooked among art historians in the West. Even in the recent books dealing specifically with photography of the Middle East, Nissan Perez has a book called Focus East, and Jacobson has a book called Odalisques and Arabesques. There are no references whatsoever to photographers and development of photography in Iran. Given this long-standing history of scholarly neglect, let me provide a brief history of photography in Iran. The history of photography in Iran dates back to the very beginning of the invention of the medium and is deeply embedded in the broader history of Europe's unofficial colonial involvement in the country. The first photographic apparatuses were given to the Qajar monarch Muhammad Shah, the father of Nasruddin Shah, between 1840 and 1842, like a year or two after the invention, by the two colonial power or semi-colonial powers in Iran, England and Russia. Soon after photography as daguerreotype was introduced to Europe in 1839, Queen Victoria and Emperor Nicholas I each gave Muhammad Shah the daguerreotype apparatus as gift. The Russian diplomat Nikolai Pavlov took the first daguerreotype of the Nasruddin Shah in 1842. Although Muhammad Shah's court was provided with written instruction, nobody in the palace apparently engaged in photography until the French educator Jules Richard came to Iran in 1844. Now this French educator and photographer, who stayed in Iran when Nasser-ed-Din Shah became a king in 1848 and adopted the name of Mirza Reza Khan after his conversion to Islam, was perhaps the first person to photograph Iranians. Richard also introduced Qajar princesses and members of the elite classes to other photographic processes such as albumen and collodion after he was appointed as a faculty in Dar al-Funun in 1851. Dar al-Funun was a technological school and kind of university. Besides Richard, many other European photographers worked in Iran in the mid-19th century and were in one way or another associated with Western colonial powers. The Italian Luigi Pesce, for example, was an officer brought by the British to create a military school across from Dar al-Funun to establish and reinforce Britain's political and cultural power in Iran. He photographed Persepolis in 1857. Luigi Montabonde, who photographed Iranian monuments and royalty in 1862, was a member of the Italian mission that tried to bolster Italy's economic and political power in Iran. And similarly, Henri de Gallouf de Bouqueville came to Iran in the late 1850s and photographed the country as part of the French military mission to the country. This is a different image than I had of him, which, like the Italian counterpart, was competing with other European powers such as England, Russia, and Austria to gain economic and political power in Iran. Even Sevrugan, Antoine Sevrugan, who was an independent and resident photographer, maintained a direct connection with the Russian embassy where his father had worked. Now, although Europeans introduced Iranians to photography, Qajar royalty took up the art with a passion. Contrary to the fallacious claim by some art historians that Muslims in the Middle East have historically viewed photographic representation of human beings as sin, the elite classes in Iran and throughout the Ottoman Empire embraced the new medium soon after its invention. There's even a more robust tradition in the Ottoman Empire, during the Ottoman Empire. Interestingly enough, in the Islamic world, the naturalism of photography as a product of light and sun was deployed to justify its uses. As Stephen Vernon has remarked, theologians and jurists in the Islamic world argue that photography was not rivaling God in the creative act because a photograph was brought about by the agency of the sun and was the result of divine activity. Thus, photography was classified as a natural science, and photographic image making was understood to be a mechanical reflection rather than an artist's creation. As a result, there's a very rich indigenous tradition of photography in Iran. But this tradition, as I will be showing, is not organic. By this I mean it is indebted to Western aesthetic genres and norms more than to its Iranian and Islamic tradition. The Qajar prince Qasim Mirza and Nasser-ed-Din Shah began taking photographs soon after the British, sorry about the bad quality of this slide, soon after the British Queen and Russian Tsar gave their father two daguerreotype apparatuses. Qasim Mirza, a Francophile who studied in France and later became an associate of the French Orientalist institution Société Asiatique, was the first Iranian to use daguerreotype and other photographic processes. Qasim Mirza's earlier portrait of Qajar prince provided the first example of Qajar photography. The first major photographer in Iran, however, was Nasser-ed-Din Shah himself, who learned photography from Richard at the age of 13 when he was the crown prince at the palace. The early introduction made him passionately pursue his art and technology when he became king in 1848. Nasser-ed-Din Shah appreciated the camera both for its honorific function, to produce images of himself and royalty, and in its repressive and disciplinary functions to consolidate his monarchical power. While becoming an amateur photographer himself, he employed both foreign and indigenous photographers to create an archive of his own portraits and dynastic rule. Recognizing the function of photography as a tool of reportage and documentation, Nasruddin Shah sent Richard on an unsuccessful mission to photograph the ruins of Iranian antiquity as early as 1850, and assigned the French photographer Bouqueville to document the military campaign against the Turkoman revolts in 1860. In addition to employing foreign photographers, he tried to train Iranians to take advantage of the medium. When Amin al-Dawla, his prime minister, was in Europe on a diplomatic mission, the Shah asked him to hire a professional photographer to introduce Iranians to the new techniques of photography. Amin al-Dawla subsequently hired a little-known Carlian and brought him to Iran in 1859. Carlian established the photographic link by teaching and training Iranians and by selling photographic equipment and chemicals to them. He taught the more advanced methods of photography, such as albumen, to Nasruddin Shah, enabling the young king to pursue his interest in taking photographs and developing them. The Shah himself trained a boy, Ghulam Hussein Khan, as his personal photography assistant to help him take private pictures of himself and his harem. So he had to be a boy that he was not mature enough to be a man to see that. Nasruddin Shah's contribution to the development of photography culminated in the establishment of Photographic Institute, Darul Khalafe Mubarakeh Nasiri, in one of the Gulistan Palace's building. He had Carlian train 2 palace attendants, Mirza Hussein Ali and Agha Reza Khan, who became a very famous photographer and went to Europe to study in new methods of photography in order to run the new Institute of Photography. In addition, with the order of Shah, a new department of photography was created at Darul Funun after the arrival of Carlian, catering mostly to government business. Nasruddin Shah's contribution to the development of photography also included the publication of several photography manuals to provide Iranians with technical knowledge about the new medium. The first such manual, Kitab al-Aqs, and the different document here, written by Mirza Kazem by the order of the Shah, dates back to 1864. Now, from the late 1850s, a large archive of photography was built as the court's own and commissioned photographers documented every official event, royal trip, royal religious figures, historical monuments. Let me show you some examples of these for your view. So this is Luigi Montalbano, who was commissioned to do these photographs, 1862. And this is the photographer, we don't know the photographer, but again, a very famous portrait, 1870s. This is Reza Kasbashi, who you see is a very early image. And all kind of playfulness, you see the playing the mustache and so on. It's very different. And this is the Shah. His attendants, they were Yela Qaislaq, went to the winter summer palaces in the north. They're traveling. These are albumen. When I reproduced them, they're black and white now. This is Antoine Sebergan with his Austrian doctor. That I have a whole reading of this in part of the book. This is Reza Kasbashi, and it's very similar poses as European photographers, if you've seen them from Now, the establishment of 2 centers of photography, one at the court and the other at the Darul Funun, allowed the Shah to use photography as a form of official reportage and as means of recording his rule. The Shah also received many photographs and albums, not only from foreign travelers, but also from indigenous and amateur professional photographers, such as Sebergan. Inspired by the Shah's interest in the new medium and fascinated by the camera's ability to produce very similar images of people and palaces, the elite classes took up photography not only as a pleasurable pastime, but also as a means to gain some influence at the court. The large number of photographs and albums dedicated to the Shah at the Gulistan Palace suggests that photography became a useful tool to become closer to him and to acquire favors from the court by both Europeans and Iranians.